She stood motionless in the desert heat at forward operating base Sentinel, wearing nothing but civilian clothes and an unremarkable identification tag. The Navy personnel barely acknowledged her presence. Commander Jackson noticed her eventually, annoyance flashing across his face as he approached. He examined her credentials and scoffed audibly, ensuring his sailors could witness. A civilian liaison badge. Those desk jockeys sent you. His mockery echoed across the naval facility as she remained silent. Then came the rumble of rotors. Black Hawks with vice, presidential insignia descended, landing precisely where she stood. The convoy that should never have been there. From which corner of the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing to Last Vengeance for more moments when authority reveals itself unexpectedly. Desert winds swept across forward operating base Sentinel, a fortress of reinforced steel and surveillance towers marking the boundary between secured territory and hostile terrain beyond. Navy personnel in crisp whites moved with practiced precision, their actions choreographed like dancers in a rehearsed performance. Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still at the outer perimeter, the sun beating down on her plain civilian shirt. She wore no insignia, no jewelry, nothing distinctive except for a small, ordinary badge attached to her collar. Her auburn hair was secured in a simple ponytail that revealed nothing of vanity or status. Her hands, steady with a thin scar along her thumb, remained relaxed at her sides as she observed the base operations with unwavering attention. The facility hummed with activity despite the oppressive heat. Sailors inspected incoming supply trucks with methodical efficiency while radio operators coordinated clearance codes through secure frequencies. Officers saluted as a lieutenant commander passed by, the naval hierarchy evident in every gesture. Through it all, Sarah watched, silent and unremarkable. Radio chatter filled the air. Bravo team confirms perimeter status. Authentication protocols active. All stations report operational readiness. The fragments of communication suggested heightened alert status, though nothing in the daily briefings indicated why. "Ma'am, you need assistance." A petty officer approached, eyeing her civilian attire with obvious suspicion. Sarah silently displayed her badge without explanation. The sailor squinted at it, confusion crossing his features. "This is just a civilian liaison badge. You'll need to." His radio crackled, summoning him elsewhere. "Stay put," he instructed before hurrying toward a disturbance at the vehicle checkpoint. From his elevated command tower, Commander Marcus Jackson spotted the civilian woman. He'd been briefed about potential liaison visits, but nothing was scheduled for this week. His expression shifted from curiosity to irritation as he watched her standing there, apparently studying his base's operations. "Who authorized a civilian observer?" He barked at his executive officer. "Unknown, sir. She just appeared." Jackson's jaw clenched. After 23 years of naval service, he developed a particular aversion to civilian administrators who believed they understood military operations from their air-conditioned offices. His base processed intelligence vital to homeland security. It wasn't a playground for bureaucratic interference. "I'll handle this myself," he declared, adjusting his uniform as he descended from the command tower. Several sailors glanced up from their stations, noting the commander's determined stride. His reputation for handling unwelcome oversight was legendary among the crew. A few exchanged knowing glances as Jackson approached the perimeter where the woman waited. Sarah noticed his approach but offered no acknowledgement. She continued her silent observation, her eyes briefly meeting Jackson's with neither deference nor defiance. "This isn't a tourist destination, miss." Jackson's voice carried the authority he'd spent decades perfecting. "Complete identification now." Sarah calmly indicated her badge. Jackson leaned closer, examining it with theatrical thoroughness before allowing himself a dismissive chuckle. "A civilian liaison badge. Those paper pushers sent you." His voice carried deliberately to nearby personnel, several of whom paused their duties to observe. The desert heat intensified, but neither Jackson nor Sarah sought shade. Sweat beaded on the commander's cap and dampened his uniform, while Sarah's civilian shirt showed no signs of discomfort. "Listen up," Jackson called louder than necessary. "Apparently, we're being observed today by..." He gestured dramatically at Sarah, inviting her to introduce herself. She remained silent. The commander's smile hardened. "Not much for conversation. That's fine. I can talk enough for both of us." He turned to his gathering staff. "The lady is here from Civilian Liaison, 4th Inspector this quarter." Several sailors chuckled. Jackson was known for his theatrical handling of bureaucratic interference. It provided entertainment in the mess hall later. "Let me explain how a naval forward operating base functions." Jackson began speaking slowly as if addressing a child. "This outer perimeter is what we call a preliminary security zone. That means, sir," a senior petty officer interrupted, looking uncomfortable. He'd noticed something about the badge that Jackson had overlooked. Jackson waved him off. "Not now, Chief." A communications specialist jogged over, message in hand, but froze when she saw Sarah up close. Her eyes widened slightly before she retreated without delivering whatever message she'd carried. On the main thoroughfare, vehicles continued processing through the checkpoint. Sailors stood at attention as a convoy of armored transports passed through, documents verified with meticulous care. The contrast between the respectful efficiency shown to military vehicles and the dismissive treatment of Sarah was stark. Sarah's phone vibrated in her pocket. She retrieved it, read a message without changing expression, then checked her watch. The subtle action didn't escape Jackson's notice. "Somewhere more pressing to be?" he asked with feigned courtesy. "I'm sure your supervisor would understand if our security protocols are too time-consuming for your schedule." Jackson's irritation grew with each passing second of Sarah's silence. "Do you even have clearance to be here? Let's see your credentials. All of them." He stepped closer, using his height advantage. "This base processes intelligence vital to national security. Your little liaison committee doesn't have jurisdiction here." Several junior sailors had stopped pretending to work, now openly watching the confrontation. One whispered to another, "William says she'll be crying in 10 minutes. Sarah finally spoke, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. "You might want to reconsider your approach, Commander." The simple statement hit Jackson like a challenge, his face flushing. "Is that a threat from a civilian?" He turned to his personnel. "This is what happens when administration gives badges to civilians with no understanding of naval protocol." The base suddenly quieted as a distant sound cut through the desert air. The distinctive thunder of helicopter rotors approaching from the eastern horizon drew everyone's attention. Jackson frowned, checking his watch. "We're not expecting any diplomatic transports today," he muttered more to himself than to Sarah. 4 Black Hawks with vice presidential insignia appeared through the heat haze, followed by support aircraft. A convoy that shouldn't have been anywhere near forward operating base Sentinel. The helicopter formation moved with precision purpose, landing exactly where Sarah stood. The lead aircraft's door opened and Agent Torres emerged, instantly recognizable as the head of the vice presidential security detail. He approached Sarah with measured steps. "Director Mitchell," he said with unmistakable deference. "Phoenix is ready for your assessment." The silence that followed was absolute. Every eye moved from Torres to Sarah, then to Commander Jackson, whose expression had frozen in mid-contempt. Jackson's gaze dropped to the badge he had so dismissively examined minutes earlier. Now, with closer attention, he saw what he'd missed. The titanium edge and the small vice presidential seal embedded in the design, markers of the elusive Phoenix Division, the highest-level intelligence operatives who reported directly to the vice president. The personnel who had been smirking moments before stood ramrod straight, expressions shifting from amusement to alarm. Agent Torres presented Sarah with a vice presidential folder marked with classified insignia. "Your findings have been confirmed, Director. Proceed as authorized." Sarah accepted the folder with a slight nod, then turned to Jackson. "Commander, your base has been compromised. 5 of your security protocols have critical vulnerabilities I identified within 15 minutes of arrival." But Jackson opened his mouth, but no words emerged. A vice presidential aide approached with a secure phone. "Sir, it's the Chief of Naval Operations for you." As Jackson took the call, his face draining of color, every sailor present snapped to attention, their salutes now directed at Sarah. The desert heat continued to beat down, but no one seemed to notice anymore. "I'll need your senior staff in the command center," Sarah said to the base's executive officer. Immediately, inside the command center, Sarah conducted a brief, authoritative meeting without notes or hesitation. She highlighted security vulnerabilities with precise, expert knowledge that only someone intimately familiar with the base's design could possess. "Your communications scanning procedure has a 12-second gap when switching between primary and backup protocols," she explained, pulling up the base's own security footage on the monitors. "Your perimeter sensors have blind spots at these 4 junctions." She marked them on the digital map. "And your data encryption is using an outdated algorithm that was compromised 5 months ago." The sailors who had laughed at her earlier now frantically took notes and implemented her recommendations without question. Jackson stood silently at the back of the room. The call with the Chief of Naval Operations had been brief but devastating. "Listen to everything Director Mitchell says. National security depends on it. We'll discuss your future assignment afterward." As the briefing concluded, fragments of context emerged through the conversations around her. Sarah had apparently warned about these exact vulnerabilities in a classified briefing with naval leadership months earlier. A briefing where her concerns had been dismissed by senior officers, including Jackson himself. The Pentagon thought a theoretical assessment was sufficient. One aide whispered to another. Director Mitchell insisted on field verification. Did you know she was coming? Another asked. Nobody knows when Phoenix is coming. That's the point. A brief flashback played in Sarah's mind. Herself in a sterile briefing room at the Pentagon, pointing out the same vulnerabilities on theoretical models, being talked over by officers with more ribbons than sense. Then later in the vice president's office, his grave expression as she explained the risks. I'll need to verify personally, she had told him. No advance notice. Even to me, he had asked with a hint of concern. Especially to you, sir. The element of surprise is essential. As Sarah prepared to leave with the vice presidential convoy, Jackson approached her, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine humility. Director Mitchell, he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. I owe you an apology. Sarah regarded him with the same steady gaze she'd maintained throughout. No, Commander, you owe your personnel better leadership. Her words were direct but not cruel. Start by listening to them regardless of their rank or appearance, especially the communications specialist who tried to alert you during our interaction. Jackson's eyes widened slightly in recognition. Petty Officer Chen identified me immediately, Sarah continued. She attempted to inform you discreetly. That kind of awareness deserves recognition, not dismissal. She handed him a sealed folder. My complete assessment. Implement these changes within 72 hours. A security team will arrive tomorrow to assist.
Yes?
Director. That would have automatically followed just 30 minutes earlier was now replaced with her proper title. Sarah nodded once, then walked to the waiting vice, presidential Black Hawk. The desert wind had finally calmed, leaving the air with that peculiar stillness that follows intense heat. Inside the aircraft, a vice presidential aide studied his tablet. Was the field test necessary, Director? We could have ordered compliance after your initial report. Sarah watched through the window as Jackson gathered his sailors, already beginning the work of transformation. People show you who they really are when they think no one important is watching, she said quietly. The vulnerabilities weren't just in their systems. The aide nodded thoughtfully. And your assessment of Commander Jackson? He'll either become a better officer after today, or he'll be replaced by one. Her tone suggested this outcome had been part of her evaluation all along. Either way, forward operating base Sentinel will be secure. As the convoy lifted off, Jackson watched it disappear over the desert horizon, the folder clutched in his hands. His expression held a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect, and perhaps something else. The recognition that he'd witnessed something rare and valuable. Not just power, but power wielded with purpose. Inside one of the aircraft, Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph or vindication, but of quiet satisfaction that the mission had been completed. The base would be secure, lives would be protected, and one more military leader had learned that authority didn't always announce itself with stripes and ribbons. Sometimes the most important people were the ones you didn't notice until it was too late. 4 weeks earlier, in a windowless conference room at the Pentagon, Sarah Mitchell stood before a panel of senior naval officials. Her presentation on base vulnerabilities had just concluded, and the silence that followed felt deliberate rather than thoughtful. These theoretical weaknesses are certainly interesting, Ms. Mitchell, Commander Jackson said finally, emphasizing her civilian title. But I assure you, in practical application, our protocols are robust. Sarah kept her expression neutral. They aren't theoretical, Commander. I've modeled these vulnerabilities using your own operational data. An admiral with 4 stars on his collar cleared his throat. We appreciate the Phoenix Division's thoroughness, but our security experts have designed these bases with redundant systems. What looks like a vulnerability on paper is covered by human oversight in practice. Murmurs of agreement circled the table. Sarah noticed how the officers avoided looking directly at her vice presidential authorization letter sitting in the center of the conference table. The titanium seal gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a reminder of authority they preferred to ignore. With respect, Admiral, Sarah said, your human oversight is precisely the problem. Base commanders have developed complacency. They're following patterns that have become predictable. Theoretical, Jackson repeated louder this time. Unless you have evidence of an actual breach. By the time we have evidence of an actual breach, lives will be lost, Sarah replied evenly. Prevention requires addressing vulnerabilities before exploitation. The meeting had ended with polite dismissal. Well, take your concerns under advisement. The bureaucratic equivalent of being patted on the head and shown the door. But Sarah had anticipated this response. which was why she'd already scheduled a meeting at the vice president's office for that afternoon. Now standing in the ornate office, Sarah watched as the vice president reviewed her report, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These bases are our first line of defense against intelligence infiltration," he said without looking up. "You're certain about these vulnerabilities?" "Yes, Mr. Vice President. Critical intelligence is passing through compromised security points daily." The vice president set down the report. "The Joint Chiefs assure me our protocols are sound." "They're wrong." Sarah's directness was why she'd been appointed to Phoenix. No politicking, no deference to rank when national security was at stake. "What do you recommend?" "Field verification." "Unannounced. I need to assess the bases personally without advanced notice to any personnel, including base commanders." "Even to me?" he asked with a hint of concern. "Especially to you, sir." "The element of surprise is essential." The vice president nodded slowly. "Authorized. But I want to be present for at least one assessment." "Choose the base you believe is most vulnerable." Sarah had chosen Forward Operating Base Sentinel, not because it was the most vulnerable, but because Commander Jackson ran it with the kind of rigid arrogance that created blind spots. His personnel followed his lead, creating a culture where appearances mattered more than substance. The perfect environment for security theater rather than actual security. The desert wind had calmed by the time Sarah's vice presidential escort arrived at the Central Command building. The change in weather seemed fitting. The sky had cleared, and so had the fog of pretense at the base. Inside the secure briefing room, senior sailors stood at attention as Sarah entered, followed by 2 members of the vice presidential security team. The atmosphere was tense, the earlier mockery replaced by anxious anticipation. "At ease," Sarah said, placing her materials on the briefing table. "This isn't a punitive exercise. It's a necessary security correction." She activated the room's display screens, bringing up schematics of the base. With a few taps on her tablet, she highlighted 5 areas in red. "Your primary vulnerabilities," she began, her voice calm and factual. "First, the communication scanning protocol creates a 12-second gap during transition between primary and backup scans. This window occurs when your operators switch between systems." The head of communications frowned. "The systems operate simultaneously." "In theory, yes. In practice, your operators are following an unofficial procedure that creates efficiency for regular traffic, but introduces a blind spot." Sarah pulled up security footage from that morning showing precisely what she described. "This adaptation has become standard practice, yet it's undocumented and unaccounted for in your security assessments." The officer's face reddened as he recognized his own team's actions. "Second," Sarah continued without pause, "your perimeter sensors have 4 blind spots created by equipment upgrades that weren't properly calibrated." She marked the locations on the digital map. "Anyone with knowledge of these gaps could bypass your outer security ring undetected." "Impossible," said a lieutenant from the engineering corps. "Those sensors were calibrated last month." "They were tested last month," Sarah corrected. "But they were tested according to original specifications, not accounting for the new equipment's different sensing angles." She displayed the diagnostic data showing the coverage gaps. "Your tests confirm the sensors work, but not that they provide complete coverage." The lieutenant's objection died on his lips as he studied the evidence. "Finally, your data encryption is using an outdated algorithm that was compromised 5 months ago in the Neptune breach." This revelation caused the most visible reaction among the staff. Your IT department received the security bulletin, but classified it as low priority because it wasn't specifically addressed to naval installations. A communications petty officer raised her hand. "Director, I flagged that bulletin. I sent 4 separate reports up the chain." Sarah nodded. "I know, Petty Officer Chen. Your reports are in the system, but were never acknowledged or acted upon." She glanced briefly at Commander Jackson, who stood silently at the back of the room. "Good intelligence is worthless if leadership doesn't respond to it." For the next 90 minutes, Sarah methodically outlined necessary corrections for each vulnerability. She assigned specific tasks to department heads, establishing clear deadlines and accountability measures. Throughout the briefing, she maintained the same calm demeanor she'd shown when being mocked at the base perimeter. Neither punitive nor triumphant. "Implementation begins immediately," she concluded. "A security team from Phoenix will arrive tomorrow to assist with the transition. I expect full compliance within 72 hours. As the sailors filed out to begin their assignments, Sarah noticed how differently they moved now, with purpose rather than the routine efficiency of earlier. Reality had replaced complacency, at least for the moment. Commander Jackson remained behind, his earlier bluster replaced by quiet attention. The call from the Chief of Naval Operations had been brief but transformative. "Listen to everything Director Mitchell says. National security depends on it. We'll discuss your future assignment afterward." When the room emptied, Jackson approached her workstation. "May I speak frankly?" Sarah continued organizing her materials. I underestimated you. Worse, I dismissed you because of assumptions I made based on appearance." "Yes." Jackson shifted uncomfortably at her directness. "In 23 years of service, I've learned to assess threats based on visible indicators, uniform, rank, posture. And that approach works most of the time," Sarah acknowledged, finally looking up at him. "Until it doesn't. The most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves. Like you. I'm not a threat, Commander. I'm a correction." She closed her tablet. "Your base's vulnerabilities weren't created by external forces. They developed from within through accumulated habits, unchallenged assumptions, and selective attention to intelligence." Jackson's jaw tightened. "You presented these same findings at the Pentagon months ago."
"Yes."
"I dismissed them then too."
"Yes."
Jackson exhaled slowly. "Why this approach? Why not simply order compliance through official channels?" Sarah studied him for a moment. "Would that have changed your mind about the vulnerabilities? Or would you have implemented changes while still believing they were unnecessary?" The question hung in the air between them. Jackson's silence was answer enough. "Effective security requires more than following protocols," Sarah continued. "It requires belief in their necessity. Today's demonstration ensured you and your staff understand the why, not just the what." Outside the command center, the vice presidential convoy waited. Sarah gathered her materials, ready to conclude her assessment. The vice president would be expecting her report before the convoy continued to its next destination. "Director Mitchell," Jackson said as she prepared to leave, "I owe you an apology." Sarah regarded him with the same steady gaze she'd maintained throughout. "No, Commander, you owe your personnel better leadership." Her words were direct but not cruel. "Start by listening to them regardless of their rank or appearance, especially the communications specialist who tried to alert you during our interaction." Jackson's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Petty Officer Chen identified me immediately," Sarah continued. "She attempted to inform you discreetly. That kind of awareness deserves recognition, not dismissal." She handed him a sealed folder. "My complete assessment. Implement these changes within 72 hours. A security team will arrive tomorrow to assist." "Yes, Director." The "ma'am" that would have automatically followed just 30 minutes earlier was now replaced with her proper title. Walking across the base grounds toward the waiting convoy, Sarah observed how differently the personnel responded to her presence now. The dismissive glances had been replaced by respectful acknowledgement. Some offered subtle nods of recognition, others straightened imperceptibly as she passed. The transformation wasn't about her status. She knew it was about their perception of value. The same information she'd presented at the Pentagon, dismissed as theoretical, was now being implemented with urgency. Nothing had changed except context and delivery. Agent Torres met her at the lead vehicle. "The Vice President is ready for your briefing, Director." Inside the secure communications suite of the Vice Presidential aircraft, Sarah found the second, in command reviewing reports on a tablet. He looked up as she entered. "Well, how severe was it?" "5 critical vulnerabilities, sir. All addressable within 72 hours. The Vice President's expression remained neutral, and Commander Jackson, receptive now that he understands the stakes. "You made quite an impression." The Chief of Naval Operations reported that Jackson sounded shaken. "That's not a word usually associated with the commander. Sometimes understanding requires demonstration, not just explanation," Sarah replied. "The vulnerabilities are being addressed, but the cultural issues that allowed them to develop will take longer to correct." "Your recommendation?" "Retain Commander Jackson in his position with quarterly unannounced inspections for the next 18 months. He's not incompetent, just complacent. Today's lesson will either improve his leadership or confirm he needs replacement." The Vice President nodded thoughtfully. "And our other bases?" "I recommend similar assessments at all 34 installations conducted by Phoenix operatives using the same approach. Showing up looking like civilians with only a badge." "Precisely. The reaction to perceived authority reveals more about security culture than scheduled inspections ever could." As the convoy prepared to depart, a vice presidential aide studied his tablet next to Sarah. "Was the field test necessary, Director? We could have ordered compliance after your initial report." Sarah watched through the window as Jackson gathered his sailors, already beginning the work of transformation. "People show you who they really are when they think no one important is watching," she said quietly. "The vulnerabilities weren't just in their systems. The aide nodded thoughtfully. And your assessment of Commander Jackson? He'll either become a better officer after today, or he'll be replaced by one. Her tone suggested this outcome had been part of her evaluation all along. Either way, forward operating base Sentinel will be secure. As the convoy lifted off, Jackson watched it disappear over the desert horizon, the folder clutched in his hands. His expression held a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect, and perhaps something else. The recognition that he'd witnessed something rare and valuable. Not just power, but power wielded with purpose. Inside one of the aircraft, Sarah finally allowed herself a small smile, not of triumph or vindication, but of quiet satisfaction that the mission had been completed. The base would be secure, lives would be protected, and one more military leader had learned that authority didn't always announce itself with stripes and ribbons. Sometimes the most important people were the ones you didn't notice until it was too late. 5 days after the vice presidential convoy left forward operating base Sentinel, Commander Marcus Jackson stood in his office, staring at the security monitors. The implementation team from the Phoenix Division had worked efficiently, installing new equipment and recalibrating existing systems with minimal disruption to operations. His personnel had adapted to the new protocols with surprising enthusiasm, perhaps motivated by the knowledge that their base had received direct vice presidential attention. The folder Sarah Mitchell had given him lay open on his desk, each page annotated with his own notes. He'd read it cover to cover 4 times, finding new insights with each review. What had initially felt like public humiliation now seemed like the most valuable lesson of his career. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called. Petty Officer Lisa Chen stepped into the office, her posture perfect. "Sir, the morning security report." Jackson gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat, Petty Officer." Surprise flickered across her face before she composed herself. Junior enlisted were rarely invited to sit in the commander's office. "The data encryption upgrade is complete," she reported, remaining standing despite the invitation. "All systems are now using the enhanced protocol recommended by Director Mitchell." "Good. And the training for your team?" "The new verification procedures completed yesterday, sir. We've run 6 simulations with 0 gaps in coverage." Jackson nodded. "You recognized Director Mitchell immediately when she arrived, didn't you?" Chen hesitated. "Yes, sir." "And you attempted to alert me?" "Yes, sir. I dismissed you without listening." "It wasn't a question." Chen maintained her professional demeanor. "You were engaged with the director, sir. It wasn't my place to interrupt." "That was exactly your place, Petty Officer. You identified a security matter that I missed. Your intervention was appropriate and necessary." He picked up a document from his desk. "I'm implementing a new protocol for forward operating base Sentinel. All personnel, regardless of rank, are authorized to use the phrase security priority if they identify a potential threat or important security information. When those words are spoken, even commanding officers will pause to listen." Tu Chen blinked. "Sir, had you been able to tell me what you recognized about Director Mitchell, the situation would have unfolded very differently. That failure was mine, not yours." Jackson handed her the document. "I'd like your input on this protocol before it's finalized." "Of course, sir." Chen took the paper, studying it carefully. "This is a significant change to chain of command procedures. Sometimes significant changes are necessary." Jackson stood and walked to the window overlooking the base. "For 23 years, I've believed that naval hierarchy was the foundation of effective security. Clear lines of authority, unquestioned orders, strict adherence to protocol." He turned back to face her. "What I failed to consider was that security doesn't flow in one direction. Intelligence moves up the chain as readily as orders move down, and both are equally important." Chen nodded slowly. "The director said something similar during the briefing. That good intelligence is worthless if leadership doesn't respond to it." She was right. Jackson returned to his desk. "Petty Officer, you're being promoted to head our Communications Security Division. Your first assignment is implementing this priority protocol and ensuring every member of this base understands its importance." "Sir?" "That position is typically held by a Chief Petty Officer. Then we'll need to arrange your promotion to Chief Petty Officer as well." Jackson allowed himself a small smile. "Unless you'd prefer to decline." "No, sir. No, I don't wish to decline. Thank you, sir." "Thank Director Mitchell. She specifically mentioned your competence in her assessment." Jackson picked up another folder. "That will be all, Chief Chen." As Chen left his office, Jackson reflected on how quickly change could happen when necessity overcame habit. 5 days ago, he would never have promoted an officer based on their willingness to challenge authority. Now, it seemed the most logical decision he'd made in years. His secure phone rang. the distinctive tone indicating a call from the Pentagon. Jackson answered promptly. "Commander Jackson speaking." "Commander, this is Admiral Richardson." The Admiral's voice was unmistakable. "I'm calling regarding the Phoenix assessment of your base." Jackson straightened instinctively, though the Admiral couldn't see him. "Yes, sir. Implementation of all recommended changes is nearly complete. So I've heard. The Chief of Naval Operations is impressed with your rapid response. To be frank, Jackson, many of us expected you to push back harder on these changes. With respect, Admiral, the assessment was correct. The vulnerabilities were real and required immediate attention." A longer pause followed. "That's not what you said in our briefing months ago." "I was wrong months ago, sir." Jackson's admission came easier than he would have expected. Director Mitchell's demonstration made that clear. The Admiral sounded thoughtful. "The other base commanders are quite concerned about these surprise assessments. There's talk of developing protocols to identify Phoenix operatives in advance." Jackson frowned. "That would defeat the purpose of the assessment, sir." "Would it? Many feel that Commander Rodriguez at Naval Station Pacific was deliberately set up to fail yesterday. His base has one of our best security records. So Sentinel hadn't been the only target." Jackson considered his response carefully. "If I may speak candidly." "Sir, go ahead." "If Naval Station Pacific failed its assessment, then its security record was based on incomplete metrics. Real threats don't announce themselves or follow our expectations. Neither should our security testing." The Admiral's laugh was unexpected. "That's almost exactly what Director Mitchell said when she proposed this initiative. She suggested you might be one of the few commanders who would understand that after experiencing it firsthand." Jackson wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Commander, I'm calling because the Joint Chiefs are creating a new security assessment task force. We need commanders who understand both traditional naval protocols and the value of unconventional testing. Director Mitchell suggested you might be the right person to lead this initiative. She recommended me." Jackson couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "After what happened at my base." "Apparently because of what happened at your base." Her exact words were, "Commander Jackson has demonstrated the ability to learn from failure and adapt quickly. Qualities essential for evolving security paradigms." The conversation continued for several minutes as the Admiral outlined the proposed task force. By the time the call ended, Jackson had been offered a promotion to captain and leadership of a program that would fundamentally change security protocols across all naval installations. As he set down the phone, he found himself wondering if this had been part of Sarah Mitchell's plan all along. The thought should have bothered him. The idea of being manipulated into a predetermined role. Instead, he felt a grudging respect for the layers of strategy at work. 4 weeks later, Captain Marcus Jackson stood in a different Pentagon briefing room, addressing 34 base commanders. The atmosphere was tense, many of the officers still smarting from their own encounters with Phoenix Division operatives. "Gentlemen, ladies," Jackson began, "I understand your frustration. 4 weeks ago, I was sitting where you are now, convinced that a civilian with a badge couldn't possibly understand the complexities of naval security operations." He allowed himself a wry smile. "I was wrong, and I suspect many of you have had similar realizations recently." A commander in the front row spoke up. "With respect, Captain, being ambushed by undercover operatives doesn't seem like a fair assessment of our capabilities." "Fair," Jackson repeated. "Commander, when did we start believing that security threats should be fair? The entire purpose of the Phoenix assessments was to identify vulnerabilities before they could be exploited by actual adversaries who, I assure you, have no interest in fairness." He activated the room's display screen, showing statistics from the 34 assessments. Every base failed in at least 3 critical areas. Not because you're incompetent, but because we've all been trained to look for threats that announce themselves, that fit our preconceived notions of what danger looks like. For the next hour, Jackson outlined the new security paradigm developed by the task force in collaboration with the Phoenix Division. The approach combined traditional naval protocols with more adaptive, responsive systems designed to identify anomalies rather than just known threat patterns. Implementation begins next month, he concluded. Each of you will receive specific recommendations for your base, along with implementation teams to assist with the transition. As the commanders filed out, Jackson noticed a figure standing quietly at the back of the room. Sarah Mitchell watched the proceedings with the same calm attentiveness she'd shown at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. When the room emptied, she approached. "Captain Jackson," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Congratulations on your promotion, Director Mitchell. I understand I have you to thank for the recommendation." You earned it through your response to the assessment. Many commanders implemented the required changes, but few understood why they were necessary. She studied him for a moment. You adapted quickly. I had a compelling demonstration of necessity. Jackson gestured to the empty chairs. Not all of them are convinced yet. They will be. Change takes time, especially in institutions built on tradition and hierarchy. Sarah placed a folder on the table, Phase 2 of the Phoenix Assessment Program. For your review when you're ready. Jackson raised an eyebrow. There's more. Security is never finished, Captain. It evolves constantly because threats evolve constantly. She turned to leave, then paused. How is Chief Chen adjusting to her new role? Exceptionally well. Her communications security protocols have been implemented at 5 other bases already. Sarah nodded, satisfied. Recognition of talent, regardless of rank or appearance, strengthens the entire system. As she walked away, Jackson called after her. Director Mitchell, may I ask you something? She turned back. Was I targeted specifically for the assessment? A ghost of a smile crossed her face. What do you think, Captain? I think nothing at Phoenix happens by chance. A fair assessment. She considered him for a moment longer. Some learn from failure better than others. You needed to fail visibly to understand what was at stake. And the promotion. Was that part of the plan too? The recommendation was. Whether you received it depended on how you responded to the assessment. Not everyone would have adapted as you did. Her expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of approval in her voice. Most people respond to humiliation with defensiveness. You chose growth instead. With that, she departed, leaving Jackson to contemplate the folder she'd left behind. Phase 2 would undoubtedly present new challenges, new paradigms to adopt. The Navy had always advanced through trials by fire, both literal and metaphorical. This was simply a different kind of battlefield. 8 months later, a junior ensign stood nervously at forward operating base Sentinel, waiting for authorization to enter. Her simple civilian clothes and unremarkable appearance drew little attention except for the badge clipped to her belt. Chief Chen approached her with professional courtesy. Good morning. May I see your credentials, please? The ensign presented her badge without speaking. Chen examined it carefully, then smiled. Phoenix Division. We've been expecting someone, though not quite so soon. She keyed her radio. Security priority. Phoenix operative at main entrance. Inform Captain Jackson immediately. Within minutes, the base had shifted smoothly into assessment protocols developed specifically for such visits. No mockery, no dismissal, just efficient, professional response to an unannounced inspection. When asked later how she had recognized the Phoenix operative so quickly, Chief Chen would smile and say, "It's not always about what you see. Sometimes it's about noticing what doesn't quite fit, what doesn't announce itself." At Phoenix Division Headquarters, Sarah Mitchell reviewed the report from Forward Operating Base Sentinel with satisfaction. The assessment had shown significant improvement in both protocols and security culture. Captain Jackson had implemented not just the required changes, but had developed new approaches that exceeded expectations. Phase 2 assessments continue to show promising results. She told the Vice President during their weekly briefing. The security paradigm is shifting from reactive to predictive across all installations. And Captain Jackson's task force, exceeding expectations. They've developed 4 new protocols that we're adopting for Phoenix operations as well. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Sometimes the best way to teach is to create the right conditions for someone to teach themselves. The Vice President nodded thoughtfully, and the other commanders who resisted initially. Most have adapted, following Jackson's example, those who couldn't have been reassigned to positions better suited to their capabilities. All from one afternoon in the desert at a base. Small moments often create the largest changes, Mr. Vice President. Sarah closed her folder. Sometimes all it takes is showing people what they've been missing all along. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet competence changed everything around them without fanfare or celebration. Share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to Last Vengeance for more stories about unexpected heroes and moments when justice arrives quietly.